So far, most of this course's example files have contained subroutines or functions that run every time you call them. There will be times, though, when you want parts of your subroutines to run when a condition is true. In business, the canonical example is calculating sales commissions. Many companies have separate commission rates for different sales totals, so I'll use that example to show you how you can use if-then statements to execute code conditionally. The data we'll work with is just this single sale amount, currently set to $1,400.25. So how can I interact with that using VBA code? Well, let me press Alt F11 to switch over, and I will show you. The first type of if-then statement you can create is called the IIF statement. The IIF statement is the equivalent of the worksheet's if function. The if function, and I'll switch back to show you how it works, is equal if, and then you have a logical test. In this case, I will test to see if the value in cell C5 is greater than 1400. Then you type comma, and you tell Excel what to do if the value is true. If that's the case, then I will have it display the value bonus. If not, I will have it do nothing. So again, we're looking at the value in cell C5, currently highlighted with a blue border. If the value there is greater than 1400, Excel will display the word bonus in cell E5 where the formula is. If not, it will do nothing. When I press enter, Excel displays the word bonus. Alt F11 to switch back. In this routine, the IIF function checks a cell's value. In this case, it's checking the active cell, which will be C5 because of the activate command, to see if that cell's value is greater than 1000, comma, and now we tell it what to do if it's true. If that's the case, then you set the commission, set as a currency variable, to the active cell value, the amount of the sale, times 6%. If it's not true, in other words, if the value is below 1000, then you multiply by 0.04 or 4% to calculate the commission. Round is the rounding function, and what it does is it cuts off a value after a certain number of decimal places. In this case, I'm having it cut it off after 2 decimal places because we're talking about a currency value. If I click inside the subroutine and press F5, Excel calculates the commission based on the value in cell C5, and that value is $84.02. You can also write an if statement that executes code when the condition is met. For example, in my second subroutine here, once again, we activate cell C5, because that's the one that contains the value in this worksheet, and check to see if the active cell value is greater than or equal to 1000. If it is, then display a message box that says great sale. I've clicked within the subroutine, and if I press F5 to run it, Excel checks the value in cell C5, which is greater than 1000, so it displays the message that I've specified. You can also create a 2-part test using an if-then-else statement, and I have an example of that sort of code here in this subroutine. What this subroutine does is, once again, it activates cell C5 and takes that value, and the first test is to see whether the value is greater than or equal to 1000. If it is, then it calculates the commission as being the active cell's value times 6% or 0.06. And again, it rounds the value to 2 decimal places. Now, rather than simply exiting the if-then statement, I can add a second condition, and that is an else condition. Basically, if the first test isn't true, I'm adding another test to see if another condition is met. In this case, rather than doing nothing, I'm going to have Excel calculate the commission as being at a 5% rate. So again, in this code, if the value was less than 1000, then the routine did nothing. In this subroutine, if the value is greater than or equal to 1000, then it calculates the commission at 6%. Otherwise, it takes the action of calculating the commission at 5%. Based on the value in the cell, the message box will display the commission, and that variable is here. So when I press F5 to run it, you'll see that once again, we get the commission of $84.02. When you create an if-then-else statement, you must pay very close attention to the structure of your if-then-else statement. Let's go back up to the if-then statement. In this case, it's all on one line. You have if and then, and the text to the right of then can appear on the same line. When you create an if-then-else statement, you can't have any more text here after the then. You must move on to the next line. If you don't, Excel will expect to see a one-line if-then statement, and it will generate an error. And actually, let me just show you how that works. When I press F5 to run the code, Excel displays a dialog box indicating that there is an else without an if. And the reason that's the case is because this is treated as a one-line if-then statement, and the else is sort of just hanging off. It is not associated with an if. So I'll click OK and return the code to its original configuration, and when I press F5, it runs correctly. The same thing goes for the else statement. The else statement must be on its own line, and you also must press return at least once to put the code that will be run if the else condition is true on a separate line. Otherwise, and I'll show you this here, Excel treats the else statement as a line label. See how the colon was added after else? That means that this line is now labeled else. And if you were to use a go-to statement, such as we'll get into later on error checking, then Excel would attempt to move to that line label. Also, because it is now treated as a line label, it's not actually part of the if-then-else statement. So your code would not function properly. And make sure that the code you want executed after the else statement is on its own line. You close it out using end if, and you have an if-then-else statement. So that's what happens if you have two conditions. But what happens if you have three or more? Well, in that case, you can use the else if statement. In this example, again, activate cell C5, which contains our value, and we're testing for multiple conditions. So the first test is whether the value in the active cell is greater than or equal to 10,000. If that's the case, then calculate the commission as being 8% of the sale. Else if, in other words, the next check, is whether the sell value is greater than or equal to 1,000. If that's the case, commission equals 6%. Else, and this is the final condition in the string, for any other value, the commission is equal to 5% of the sale. And again, you close it out with an end if. As before, after you type then, the statement you want executed, if the original condition is true, must be on its own line. Notice, however, that else if, as opposed to being treated like an else, is treated like another if statement. That means that you have the test on its own line, then at the end of the line, and you press enter at least once to put the code that will be executed if that condition is true on the next line. So let's go for a couple of examples to see how that code works. The value in the workbook right now is $1,400.25. If I press F5 to run this code, I get the same value we had before. But now, pressing Alt F11, if I change the value to 14,000, go back into the code module and press F5, now the commission is significantly higher. It's $1,120.02, and also it was calculated at an 8% rate. We know that from how the code was written. If-then statements let you decide when to execute code segments based on criteria you set. As I mentioned before, you must pay very close attention to the if-then statement structure to avoid having errors in your code.